the dusty town of Cedar Ridge, Utah, the year 1872 brought more than just harsh winters and cattle disputes. It brought a mystery that would haunt the American West for generations to come. Sheriff Thomas Whitmore had been the law in this remote settlement for nearly a decade, a man whose reputation stretched across 3 territories. His weathered hands had drawn iron against outlaws, his steady voice had calmed lynch mobs, and his unwavering sense of justice had earned him respect from ranchers and townsfolk alike. But on a cold November morning, Sheriff Whitmore's story took a turn that defied everything the good people of Cedar Ridge thought they knew about life, death, and the thin veil between worlds. The tale begins with what seemed like an ordinary pursuit. 3 men had robbed the Territorial Bank in nearby Millfield, making off with nearly $2,000 in gold and currency. Word reached Cedar Ridge by telegraph, and Sheriff Whitmore assembled a small posse to track the bandits through the unforgiving Utah wilderness. What followed was a chase that would lead them deep into the Wasatch Mountains, where ancient Ute legends spoke of spirits that never found rest, and where the harsh landscape had claimed more lives than any outlaw's gun. If you're drawn to the darker chapters of American history, where folklore meets documented fact, then you're about to discover one of the most chilling true stories ever recorded in the annals of Western horror. This isn't just another ghost story whispered around campfires. This is a meticulously documented case that challenges everything we think we know about the boundaries between life and death. The posse that rode out of Cedar Ridge on November 15th consisted of 5 men: Sheriff Whitmore, his deputy Samuel Morrison, local rancher Jake Henley, tracker William Bill Crenshaw, and Dr. Marcus Webb, who often served as the town's unofficial coroner. Each man was chosen for his particular skills and unwavering courage. They carried provisions for a week, expecting to corner the bandits within days and return them to face territorial justice. The trail led them through increasingly treacherous terrain, winding through narrow canyons where the November wind howled like banshees, and across high plateaus where early snow made tracking both easier and more dangerous. Bill Crenshaw, half Cherokee and the finest tracker in 3 counties, followed signs that told a story of desperate men pushing their horses beyond endurance. The bandits were making for the high country, perhaps hoping to lose their pursuers in the maze of ravines and hidden valleys that honeycombed the Wasatch Range. On the 2nd day, they found the first horse, a bay gelding that had collapsed from exhaustion and been left to die. Its saddle bore the mark of the Millfield livery, confirming they were on the right trail. Dr. Webb examined the animal with the same methodical care he brought to his medical practice, noting that the horse had been ridden hard for at least 36 hours straight. The bandits were desperate, pushing deeper into country that even the local Ute avoided during winter months. By the 3rd day, the weather had turned savage. A blizzard swept down from the peaks, transforming the landscape into a white hell where visibility dropped to mere yards. The posse took shelter in a shallow cave, huddling around a meager fire, while the wind shrieked outside like the voices of the damned. It was here that Bill Crenshaw first mentioned the old stories, the Ute legends about this particular region of the mountains. According to tribal lore, these peaks were home to what the Ute called the hungry spirits, the souls of those who had died violent deaths in the wilderness and could find no peace. The Cherokee side of Bill's heritage had similar stories, tales of places where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead grew thin. Dr. Webb, a man of science and reason, dismissed such talk as primitive superstition. But Sheriff Whitmore, who had spent years learning to read the subtle signs of danger in men's faces and voices, noticed something in Bill's eyes that suggested the tracker believed every word he spoke. The storm raged for 18 hours, and when it finally passed, they emerged to find a world transformed. The familiar landmarks had vanished beneath 3 feet of fresh snow, and the temperature had plummeted to levels that could kill an exposed man in minutes. Worse still, they had lost the trail completely. The bandits' tracks had been obliterated by the blizzard, leaving the posse to search blindly through a frozen wasteland where every wrong turn could mean death. It was Deputy Morrison who spotted the smoke rising from a distant valley, a thin gray line against the pewter sky that suggested human presence in this desolate wilderness. The posse made their way carefully down the treacherous slope, following game trails barely visible beneath the snow. As they descended, the temperature seemed to drop even further, and their horses grew increasingly nervous, snorting and shying at shadows that weren't there. The smoke led them to an abandoned mining camp, a collection of ramshackle buildings that had been deserted for at least 5 years. But someone had recently been there. The smoke was rising from the chimney of what had once been the camp's main bunkhouse. Sheriff Whitmore deployed his men strategically, surrounding the building with the practiced efficiency of men who had faced armed desperados before. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through the ruined structures and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. When they called for the occupants to surrender, the response was immediate and violent. Gunfire erupted from the windows of the bunkhouse, muzzle flashes lighting up the dim interior like lightning. The bandits had indeed taken refuge here, and they were prepared to fight to the death rather than face the hangman's noose. What followed was a fierce gun battle that echoed through the valley like thunder, the sharp crack of rifles and the deeper boom of pistols creating a deadly symphony that sent wildlife fleeing for miles around. The firefight lasted nearly an hour, with both sides taking cover behind whatever shelter they could find in the abandoned camp. Sheriff Whitmore proved once again why his reputation had spread across the territories, his steady aim and tactical thinking keeping his men alive, while they gradually tightened the noose around their quarry. Deputy Morrison took a bullet through the shoulder, but continued fighting, while Rancher Henley's hat was ventilated by 3 separate shots, without the man himself suffering so much as a scratch. It was Dr. Webb who ended the battle with a stroke of tactical genius that belied his medical profession. While the others kept the bandits pinned down with covering fire, he worked his way around to the back of the bunkhouse and managed to smoke them out by setting fire to the building's rear wall. The 3 robbers emerged coughing and choking, their weapons empty and their resolve finally broken. They surrendered without further resistance, hands raised high as the flames consumed their refuge behind them. The captured men were exactly who the posse expected to find: hardened criminals with prices on their heads in multiple territories. Their leader, a scarred man named Dutch Kowalski, had been wanted for armed robbery and murder from Colorado to Nevada. His companions, the Brennan brothers, were known for their vicious temper and their willingness to kill anyone who stood in their way. The stolen money was recovered intact, hidden beneath the floorboards of the burning bunkhouse in canvas bags that still bore the Millfield Bank's official seals. With their prisoners secured and the stolen money recovered, the posse should have been celebrating a successful conclusion to their mission. But as they prepared to make camp for the night before beginning the journey back to Cedar Ridge, Sheriff Whitmore began to feel uneasy. The abandoned mining camp seemed to press in around them as darkness fell, and the shadows cast by their campfire danced in ways that suggested movement where none should exist. Bill Crenshaw was visibly agitated, constantly checking and rechecking the bonds on their prisoners, while muttering prayers in Cherokee under his breath. When questioned, he explained that this place felt wrong, that the very air seemed heavy with malevolent presence. The horses shared his unease, refusing to settle despite their exhaustion, their eyes rolling white as they stared into the darkness beyond the firelight. Dr. Webb attempted to provide rational explanations for their collective nervousness: the stress of the pursuit, the thin air at high altitude, the natural human response to an unfamiliar and potentially dangerous environment. But even his scientific mind couldn't entirely dismiss the feeling that they were being watched by unseen eyes, that something in the darkness was studying them with predatory interest. Sheriff Whitmore, a man who had faced down killers and survived countless dangerous situations, found himself checking his weapons more frequently than usual and starting at sounds that might have been nothing more than the wind. The first watch passed without incident, though Deputy Morrison reported hearing what sounded like voices calling from the surrounding forest, voices that seemed to come from no particular direction and spoke words in no language he recognized. When Bill Crenshaw took the second watch, he built up the fire higher than necessary and kept his rifle across his knees, his dark eyes scanning the tree line with the intensity of a man expecting attack at any moment. It was during the third watch, with Sheriff Whitmore himself standing guard, that the first truly inexplicable event occurred. The campfire, which had been burning steadily all night, suddenly flared up to 3 times its normal height, casting wild shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. In that moment of brilliant illumination, Whitmore could have sworn he saw figures standing just beyond the circle of light, tall, gaunt shapes that might have been men or might have been something else entirely. When the fire returned to normal a few seconds later, the shapes were gone. leaving the sheriff to wonder if exhaustion and stress had finally gotten the better of his usually reliable senses. But the horses had seen something too. They were pulling at their tethers and whinnying in terror, their eyes fixed on the same spot where Whitmore thought he had seen the mysterious figures. Even the hardened criminals they had captured seemed affected, Dutch Kowalski staring into the darkness with an expression that mixed fear with something approaching recognition. Dawn brought relief from the oppressive atmosphere of the night, but it also brought a new problem. During the early morning hours, a thick fog had rolled into the valley, reducing visibility to mere feet and making travel impossible. The mist seemed unnatural, clinging to the ground with an oily persistence that defied the mountain winds that should have dispersed it. Worse still, the fog carried with it a smell, the sickly sweet odor of decay that Dr. Webb recognized from his medical practice as the scent of death. As they waited for the fog to lift, the members of the posse found themselves drawn into conversation with their prisoners, partly from boredom and partly from a shared sense of unease that transcended the usual boundaries between lawmen and outlaws. Dutch Kowalski proved surprisingly talkative, revealing that this wasn't the first time he had been in these mountains. Years earlier, he had been part of a different gang that had used the abandoned mining camp as a hideout, and he spoke of strange experiences that had driven them away after only a few nights. According to Kowalski, the camp had been abandoned not because the mine played out, but because of a series of unexplained deaths that had terrorized the miners. Men would vanish from their bunks during the night, only to be found days later in impossible locations, at the bottom of mine shafts that had been sealed, or frozen solid in ice caves miles from the camp. The survivors spoke of voices calling to them from the darkness, of shadows that moved without anything to cast them, and of a presence that seemed to hunger for human life itself. Dr. Webb listened to these stories with the skeptical ear of a man trained in rational thought, but even he had to admit that something about this place felt fundamentally wrong. The fog continued to swirl around them with an almost purposeful movement, and the silence was so complete that their own voices seemed muffled and distorted. When Deputy Morrison attempted to scout ahead on foot, he returned within minutes, claiming that the fog seemed to shift and move to block his path no matter which direction he tried to go. Bill Crenshaw shared more of the Ute legends, explaining that his people considered this entire region to be cursed ground, a place where the spirits of those who died violently were trapped between worlds. According to tribal tradition, these spirits grew hungry over time, feeding on the life force of any living beings foolish enough to enter their domain. The tracker's grandfather had been a medicine man, and he had taught Bill to recognize the signs of spiritual corruption, the unnatural fog, the behavior of animals, the feeling of being watched by invisible eyes. Sheriff Whitmore found himself caught between his natural skepticism and the growing evidence that something genuinely supernatural was at work. As a lawman, he dealt in facts and evidence, but the facts in this case seemed to point toward conclusions that defied rational explanation. The horses continued to show signs of extreme distress. The prisoners were visibly terrified despite their usual bravado, and even his own men were beginning to talk in hushed whispers about the possibility that they had stumbled into something beyond their understanding. By midday, the fog had still not lifted, and the decision was made to break camp and attempt to navigate by compass alone. They couldn't afford to wait indefinitely. Deputy Morrison's shoulder wound needed proper medical attention, and their supplies were running low. More importantly, Sheriff Whitmore was beginning to fear that prolonged exposure to whatever malevolent influence pervaded this place might have permanent consequences for all of them. The journey through the fog-shrouded wilderness became a nightmare of confusion and misdirection. Despite following a steady compass bearing, they seemed to be walking in circles, repeatedly encountering landmarks they had passed hours earlier. The fog muffled sound in strange ways, making it difficult to communicate even at close range, and more than once they nearly lost track of each other, despite being roped together for safety. It was during one of these disorienting detours that Sheriff Whitmore became separated from the group. One moment he was following Deputy Morrison's horse through the swirling mist, and the next he found himself alone in a silence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums like physical weight. His calls to the others were swallowed by the fog, and when he fired his pistol into the air as a signal, the sound seemed to die just feet from the barrel. For the first time in his career as a lawman, Thomas Whitmore experienced true terror. Not the adrenaline-charged fear of facing armed criminals, but the deep, primal dread of being utterly alone in a hostile and unnatural environment. As Sheriff Whitmore stumbled through the fog, desperately trying to rejoin his companions, he began to hear the voices that Deputy Morrison had reported during his watch. They seemed to come from all directions at once, speaking in languages he didn't recognize but conveying emotions he understood all too well: hunger, longing, and an endless, aching need. The voices grew stronger as he walked, and with them came visions that appeared in the swirling mist like scenes from a fever dream. He saw the mining camp as it had been in its heyday, bustling with activity as dozens of men worked to extract silver from the mountain's depths. But the vision was wrong somehow. The colors too vivid, the movements too fluid, as if he were watching actors performing on a stage rather than real people going about their daily lives. And there was something else, a darkness at the edge of the scene, a creeping shadow that seemed to devour everything it touched. The vision shifted, showing him the camp's final days. Men disappeared one by one, their empty bunks a testament to some unseen predator that stalked the settlement. The survivors huddled together in terror, speaking in whispers of things that moved in the darkness and voices that called their names from empty tunnels. And then, in a moment of horrifying clarity, Sheriff Whitmore saw himself, not as he was now, but as he would be, standing among the shadows with eyes that reflected no light and a face that bore the mark of something that was no longer entirely human. The vision shattered as a gunshot echoed through the fog, and Sheriff Whitmore heard Bill Crenshaw's voice calling his name. Following the sound, he stumbled through the mist until he collided with Deputy Morrison's horse, nearly causing both man and animal to topple over. The reunion was brief but emotional. His men had been searching for him for over 2 hours, firing signal shots and calling his name until their voices were hoarse. But their relief was short-lived. During Whitmore's absence, the fog had begun to take on an even more sinister quality. Shapes moved within it, not the vague shadows they had glimpsed before, but distinct figures that seemed to be stalking the group with predatory intent. The prisoners were in a state of near panic, Dutch Kowalski babbling prayers in Polish while the Brennan brothers sat back to back, their eyes darting constantly between the swirling walls of mist that surrounded them. Dr. Webb had been taking notes throughout their ordeal, his scientific training compelling him to document even the most inexplicable phenomena. His observations painted a picture of environmental conditions that should have been impossible. Temperatures that varied by 20 degrees within a few yards, compass readings that changed without explanation, and atmospheric pressure that seemed to fluctuate in ways that defied meteorological science. Yet even his methodical approach couldn't explain the growing sense that they were no longer alone in the fog, that something was circling them like a pack of wolves preparing to attack. As afternoon faded toward evening, the situation grew increasingly desperate. The fog showed no signs of lifting, their supplies were nearly exhausted, and the horses were becoming increasingly difficult to control. More disturbing still were the changes in the men themselves. Deputy Morrison had begun muttering to himself in a monotone voice, repeating phrases in a language none of them recognized, while Rancher Henley stared fixedly into the mist as if seeing things that weren't visible to the others. It was Bill Crenshaw who finally provided a possible solution, though it came at a cost none of them wanted to pay. According to Cherokee tradition, places corrupted by spiritual malevolence could sometimes be appeased through sacrifice, not necessarily of life, but of something precious to the living. The tracker suggested that they might be able to escape the fog's influence by leaving behind something of significant value, essentially paying a toll to whatever forces held them trapped. The debate that followed revealed the depth of their desperation. Dr. Webb argued for a rational approach, suggesting they simply wait for natural weather patterns to clear the fog, but his scientific confidence was undermined by the evidence of his own senses. Sheriff Whitmore found himself torn between his duty to bring the prisoners back for trial and his responsibility to keep his men alive. The stolen money represented justice for the victims of the bank robbery, but what good was justice if none of them survived to see it served? The decision was made as darkness began to fall and the shapes in the fog grew bolder, approaching close enough for the men to catch glimpses of faces that might once have been human, but now bore the terrible mark of something far worse. Sheriff Whitmore, drawing on reserves of courage that had served him throughout his career, took one of the canvas bags containing the stolen money and walked alone into the mist. The others heard him speaking, though his words were indistinct and seemed to be addressed to someone, or something, they couldn't see. When he returned, the bag was gone, and the change in their surroundings was immediate and dramatic. The fog began to thin, revealing patches of darkening sky and the familiar outlines of the mountain peaks around them. The oppressive silence lifted, replaced by the normal sounds of wind through pine trees and the distant call of an owl. Even the horses seemed to sense the change, their panic subsiding as the unnatural atmosphere that had held them captive finally began to dissipate. But their relief was tempered by a disturbing realization. Sheriff Whitmore himself had changed during his brief encounter with whatever forces controlled this cursed place. His eyes held a distant quality, as if he were seeing things that existed beyond the normal range of human perception, and when he spoke, his voice carried an odd echo that seemed to come from somewhere far away. Dr. Webb's medical examination revealed nothing obviously wrong, but the sheriff's responses to questions were often delayed, as if he had to translate them from some other language before understanding their meaning. The journey back to Cedar Ridge took 3 days longer than expected, partly due to Deputy Morrison's injury, and partly because Sheriff Whitmore seemed to have difficulty navigating terrain he had known for years. He would stop frequently, staring at landmarks with confusion, or take detours that led nowhere before returning to the main trail with no explanation for his behavior. The other members of the posse began to whisper among themselves, sharing concerns about their leader's condition that none of them wanted to voice openly. The prisoners, surprisingly, showed more sympathy for the sheriff's plight than might have been expected from hardened criminals. Dutch Kowalski spoke quietly to Dr. Webb about similar changes he had observed in members of his previous gang who had spent time in the Cursed Valley. According to the outlaw, men who encountered the hungry spirits were never quite the same afterward. They carried something of that dark place with them, a shadow that grew stronger over time until it consumed whatever remained of their original personality. As they descended from the high country into the familiar valleys around Cedar Ridge, the November cold gave way to the warmer air of lower elevations, but Sheriff Whitmore seemed increasingly affected by temperatures that didn't bother the others. He wrapped himself in extra blankets and rode close to their evening campfires, yet still complained of a chill that seemed to come from within his bones rather than from the external environment. More troubling still were the moments when he would respond to voices that no one else could hear, carrying on conversations with invisible companions who seemed to know him by name. The posse's return to Cedar Ridge on November 28th was met with celebration from the townspeople, who had begun to fear that their sheriff and his men had been lost to the early winter storms. The successful capture of the bank robbers and recovery of the stolen money, minus the bag that had been left in the mountains, was seen as another triumph for law and order in a region where justice often came at the end of a gun barrel. But those closest to Sheriff Whitmore couldn't ignore the changes in their normally steady and reliable leader. His wife, Martha, noticed immediately that something was wrong, though she couldn't put her finger on exactly what had altered about the man she had been married to for 15 years. He seemed distant and distracted, often staring out the window of their home, as if watching for something that never appeared. His appetite vanished, and he complained constantly of being cold, despite the warm fires she kept burning in every room. Dr. Webb conducted a thorough medical examination, but could find nothing physically wrong with the sheriff beyond signs of exhaustion and exposure, consistent with their ordeal in the mountains. However, he privately noted several disturbing symptoms that didn't fit any medical condition he had studied. The sheriff's body temperature was consistently lower than normal. His pulse was irregular in ways that suggested cardiac stress, and his responses to questions about recent events were often confused or contradictory. Most troubling of all was the way Whitmore's eyes seemed to track movement that wasn't there, as if he were seeing people or objects that existed only in his own perception. As December progressed, Sheriff Whitmore's condition continued to deteriorate in ways that defied medical explanation. He lost weight rapidly despite Martha's efforts to tempt him with his favorite foods, and his skin took on a grayish pallor that made him look years older than his actual age. He began to avoid mirrors, claiming that his reflection looked wrong somehow, though he couldn't explain what he meant by that statement. His behavior became increasingly erratic. He would patrol the town at all hours of the night, checking and rechecking doors and windows as if searching for some specific threat that only he could perceive. Townspeople reported seeing him standing motionless on street corners, staring up at the mountains with an expression of longing that troubled those who had known him as a decisive and action-oriented man. When approached, he would seem startled, as if awakening from a dream. and would have difficulty remembering why he was there or what he had been doing. The final week of November brought the first heavy snows of winter to Cedar Ridge, and with them came a marked change in Sheriff Whitmore's condition. He seemed to gain energy as the temperature dropped, becoming more alert and active than he had been since returning from the mountains. But this improvement came with a disturbing side effect. He began to speak frequently of the need to return to the high country, claiming that he had left something important behind and that the voices were calling him to come back and retrieve it. On December 5th, Sheriff Thomas Whitmore was found dead in his bed by his wife Martha, who had grown accustomed to his restless nights and hadn't been alarmed when he failed to rise at his usual early hour. Dr. Webb's examination revealed no obvious cause of death. The sheriff's heart had simply stopped beating sometime during the night, with no signs of disease, injury, or poisoning to explain his sudden passing. The funeral was held 3 days later, with the entire town turning out to pay their respects to a man who had served them faithfully for nearly a decade. Sheriff Whitmore was laid to rest in the Cedar Ridge Cemetery, on a hillside that offered a clear view of the Wasatch Mountains where he had encountered whatever force had ultimately claimed his life. The service was conducted by Reverend Samuel Hayes, who spoke eloquently of the sheriff's dedication to justice and his sacrifice in the service of his community. Among the mourners were the members of the posse who had shared his final adventure, each man carrying his own memories of what they had witnessed in that fog-shrouded valley. Bill Crenshaw performed a Cherokee blessing over the grave, asking the spirits of his ancestors to guide Thomas Whitmore's soul to a place of peace and rest. Dr. Webb contributed a medical perspective, suggesting that the sheriff had died from complications related to exposure and stress, though privately he remained troubled by aspects of the case that didn't fit any known pathology. The week following Sheriff Whitmore's funeral passed quietly in Cedar Ridge, with Deputy Morrison assuming temporary responsibility for law enforcement, while the town council deliberated on the selection of a permanent replacement. The winter of 1872 was proving to be particularly harsh, with heavy snows isolating the community from the outside world for days at a time. Life settled into the familiar rhythm of a frontier town, hunkering down to wait out the cold months, with residents gathering in the saloon and general store to share news and gossip while the wind howled outside. It was during this period of enforced isolation that the first strange reports began to surface. Mrs. Abigail Fletcher, who lived near the cemetery, claimed to have seen a figure walking among the graves during the early morning hours of December 12th. The figure appeared to be a man of average height and build, wearing clothes similar to those Sheriff Whitmore had favored, but the distance and pre-dawn darkness made positive identification impossible. Similar sightings were reported over the following days by other residents whose homes offered views of the hillside cemetery. The figure always appeared alone, always during the hours before sunrise, and always seemed to be moving with purpose among the headstones as if searching for something specific. When investigated during daylight hours, the snow around the graves showed no sign of disturbance, leading some to dismiss the reports as tricks of light and shadow or the product of grief-stricken imaginations. The sightings might have been dismissed entirely if not for the testimony of young Timothy Morrison, Deputy Morrison's 12-year-old son, who possessed the keen eyesight and natural curiosity of youth. On the morning of December 15th, Timothy was up early to tend to his family's livestock when he observed the mysterious figure more clearly than any previous witness had managed. According to the boy, the man walking among the graves bore an unmistakable resemblance to the late Sheriff Whitmore, down to his characteristic way of walking with his right shoulder slightly higher than his left, a quirk that had developed after an old gunshot wound. Deputy Morrison initially dismissed his son's account as the product of an overactive imagination, but Timothy's detailed description included elements that the boy couldn't possibly have known unless he had actually observed them. The figure wore Sheriff Whitmore's distinctive star-shaped badge, carried his preferred model of Colt revolver, and even displayed the slight limp that had resulted from a horse-riding accident years earlier. Most convincing of all was Timothy's description of the figure's face, pale and drawn, but undeniably recognizable as that of Thomas Whitmore. Word of Timothy's sighting spread quickly through the close-knit community, sparking intense debate about the nature of what the boy had witnessed. The more religious residents suggested that Sheriff Whitmore's spirit was unable to find peace, perhaps due to some unfinished business related to his final case. Others, influenced by the growing body of spiritualist literature that was popular in the eastern states, speculated that the sheriff was attempting to communicate some important message from beyond the grave. Dr. Webb approached the mystery with his characteristic scientific skepticism, but even he couldn't entirely dismiss the accumulating evidence. He interviewed each witness separately, documenting their accounts with the same methodical care he brought to his medical practice. The consistency of the descriptions was remarkable. Every witness described the same general appearance, the same purposeful movement among the graves, and the same timing of the appearances just before dawn. More intriguing still was the pattern that emerged from plotting the sightings on a map of the cemetery. The figure consistently appeared near Sheriff Whitmore's grave, but its movements seemed to follow a specific route that led to other burial sites scattered throughout the hillside. Dr. Webb's investigation revealed that these other graves belonged to individuals who had died under violent or mysterious circumstances, victims of gunfights, accidents, and unexplained disappearances that had occurred over the past decade. The doctor's rational mind sought natural explanations for the phenomena. Perhaps grief and suggestion had created a form of mass hallucination, or maybe someone was deliberately impersonating the dead sheriff for reasons unknown. But his scientific training also compelled him to consider the possibility that they were witnessing something genuinely unprecedented, evidence of survival after death that challenged the fundamental assumptions of medical science. As December progressed toward Christmas, the apparition's appearances became more frequent and more visible to a growing number of witnesses. What had begun as occasional glimpses in the pre-dawn darkness evolved into regular sightings that occurred at predictable times and locations. The figure seemed to be gaining substance and clarity, as if whatever force animated it was growing stronger with each passing day. The change was most noticeable to those who had known Sheriff Whitmore personally. Martha Whitmore, despite her initial skepticism, found herself drawn to her bedroom window each morning before sunrise, watching the cemetery with a mixture of hope and terror. On December 20th, she finally saw what others had been reporting, a figure that moved with her husband's familiar gait, pausing at his own grave before continuing on to visit other burial sites with the methodical thoroughness that had characterized his approach to law enforcement. The emotional impact of seeing her deceased husband walking among the graves was overwhelming, but Martha forced herself to observe carefully, noting details that might help explain what she was witnessing. The figure appeared solid and three-dimensional, casting shadows in the moonlight and leaving what appeared to be footprints in the snow. But there were also disturbing differences. The sheriff's face was paler than it had been in life. His movements were slightly too fluid, and his eyes seemed to reflect light in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of a nocturnal animal. The climax of the supernatural events came on December 23rd, exactly 1 week after Sheriff Whitmore's funeral, when the apparition was witnessed not just walking through the cemetery, but actually entering the town itself. Multiple residents reported seeing the figure moving down Main Street with the measured pace of a man making his rounds, checking doors and windows, just as the living sheriff had done during his nightly patrols. Mrs. Eleanor Hastings, who operated the town's boarding house, observed the figure pause outside her establishment and peer through the front windows as if examining the interior. She described the experience as profoundly unsettling. While the figure looked like Sheriff Whitmore, something about its presence felt fundamentally wrong, as if she were looking at a convincing imitation rather than the genuine article. The apparition seemed to sense her observation, turning to look directly at her with eyes that held an intelligence that was unmistakably human yet somehow alien. The most dramatic encounter occurred when the figure approached the jail where Deputy Morrison was working late, reviewing case files by lamplight. Morrison later described hearing familiar footsteps on the wooden sidewalk outside, followed by the sound of someone trying the door handle. When he looked up, he saw Sheriff Whitmore's face peering through the window, but the expression was wrong, too intense, too hungry, as if the man he had known and respected had been replaced by something that merely wore his appearance like a disguise. Deputy Morrison's confrontation with the apparition provided the most detailed account of the phenomenon that had been terrorizing Cedar Ridge. According to Morrison, the figure spoke in Sheriff Whitmore's voice, but the words seemed to come from a great distance, as if echoing through a long tunnel. The apparition claimed that it had unfinished business to attend to, that there were matters of justice that required its attention before it could find peace. When Morrison asked what kind of business, the figure's response was both cryptic and disturbing. It spoke of debts that needed to be collected, of accounts that had to be balanced, and of a hunger that grew stronger with each passing day. Most chilling of all was its insistence that it was not alone, that others from the cursed valley had followed it back to Cedar Ridge and were even now walking among the living, seeking to reclaim what had been taken from them. The conversation ended abruptly when the figure noticed Dr. Webb approaching the jail with several other townsmen, armed with lanterns and shotguns. The apparition stepped back from the window and seemed to dissolve into the shadows, leaving Morrison to wonder if he had experienced a genuine supernatural encounter, or if the stress of recent events had finally affected his sanity. The sheriff's badge lay cold in Martha's palm as she stood in the cemetery, the metal still warm despite the October chill. Around her, the townspeople of Cedar Ridge gathered in hushed circles, their faces pale in the moonlight. The grave that had held Thomas McKinnon for 7 days now gaped open, empty soil scattered like dark secrets across the headstone. Martha closed her eyes, remembering the weight of dirt falling on his coffin, the finality of that sound. Yet here she stood, holding proof that death itself seemed negotiable in this corner of Utah territory. The badge bore Thomas's initials, etched deep by the town blacksmith 3 years prior when he'd first pinned it to his vest. No one else could have carried it. No one else would have known its significance. As she opened her eyes, Martha saw her own reflection in the polished metal, distorted and strange. The crowd began to disperse, unable to comprehend what they'd witnessed, but Martha remained. She understood now that some mysteries in the American West ran deeper than any folklore could capture, deeper than any ghost story whispered around campfires. This was something else entirely, something that challenged everything she thought she knew about life, death, and the thin line between them in this harsh, unforgiving land. Dr. Harrison arrived at dawn, his medical bag clutched tight against his chest as he surveyed the disturbed grave. The physician had pronounced Thomas dead himself, had felt for a pulse that never came, had closed those vacant eyes with his own trembling fingers. Now, faced with the impossible evidence before him, his scientific mind reeled. He knelt beside the empty coffin, running his hands along the satin lining, searching for some rational explanation. The wood showed no signs of damage from within, no scratches or gouges that might suggest someone had clawed their way out. The coffin remained intact, as if Thomas had simply vanished into the morning air. Harrison's medical training, honed through years of frontier practice, offered no precedent for what he witnessed. He'd seen men survive impossible wounds, had witnessed the resilience of the human spirit against overwhelming odds, but this transcended the boundaries of medical possibility. The doctor's hands shook as he examined the soil, noting how it had been displaced not from below, but from above, as if the earth itself had parted to release its unwilling prisoner. In his decades of practice across the American frontier, Harrison had encountered many mysteries, but none that challenged the very foundation of his understanding, like this dark western tale unfolding before him. As news of the empty grave spread beyond Cedar Ridge, it attracted attention from unexpected quarters. A traveling journalist named Samuel Pierce arrived from Salt Lake City, drawn by reports of what locals were calling a genuine American folklore event in the making. Pierce had made his career documenting the stranger stories of Western expansion, the tales that newspapers back east dismissed as frontier superstition. But this story felt different, grounded in verifiable facts and witnessed by dozens of credible townspeople. He interviewed Martha, Dr. Harrison, and anyone else willing to speak about Thomas McKinnon's impossible return. Each account remained consistent, lacking the embellishments and contradictions typical of tall tales. Pierce found himself documenting what appeared to be a true horror story, one that challenged his own skeptical nature. The journalist's presence brought unwanted attention to Cedar Ridge, as word spread through telegraph lines and newspaper columns. Soon, curiosity seekers and thrill hunters began arriving, transforming the quiet mining town into a spectacle. The townspeople, already shaken by recent events, found themselves under scrutiny from outsiders who treated their trauma as entertainment. Martha watched the circus atmosphere develop with growing unease, knowing that somewhere in the wilderness beyond town, Thomas McKinnon remained at large, his intentions unknown, and his very existence a challenge to the natural order. The psychological toll on Cedar Ridge's residents became increasingly apparent as days passed without answers. Children refused to play near the cemetery, and even the bravest adults found excuses to avoid the area after dark. The town's minister, Reverend Collins, struggled to provide comfort to his congregation while grappling with his own crisis of faith. How could he explain resurrection outside the context of divine miracle? How could he counsel families terrified that their own buried loved ones might return? The Reverend spent sleepless nights studying Scripture, searching for precedent or guidance that never came. His Sunday sermons became strained affairs, filled with platitudes that rang hollow in the face of inexplicable events. Meanwhile, the town's children created their own explanations, weaving Thomas McKinnon into playground rhymes and games that their parents found disturbing. The younger generation seemed more adaptable to the impossible, accepting mystery where adults demanded answers. This generational divide added another layer of tension to an already fractured community. Dr. Harrison noted an increase in anxiety-related ailments among his patients, while Martha found herself unable to sleep without checking and rechecking the locks on her doors. The historical horror they were living through had transformed their understanding of mortality itself, leaving psychological scars that would outlast any physical wounds. The townspeople gathered at the cemetery as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the weathered headstones. Sheriff Marcus Kane stood beside his own grave, the freshly turned earth a stark reminder of what should have been his final resting place. The preacher held his worn Bible with trembling hands, struggling to comprehend the miracle, or curse, that stood before them all. Kane's presence defied every natural law they understood, yet there he was, solid and real as the day he'd first pinned on his badge. The wind carried whispers of ancient Ute prayers, as if the very land itself was trying to make sense of this supernatural occurrence. Some townspeople wept, others crossed themselves repeatedly, but all remained transfixed by the impossible sight. Kane's eyes held depths of experience that seemed to span beyond mortal understanding, as if his brief journey beyond the veil had granted him knowledge of mysteries that haunted the American frontier. The cemetery, once a place of finality and rest, had become the stage for something that would challenge everything Cedar Ridge thought they knew about life, death, and the thin boundaries between worlds. As darkness settled over Utah territory, the community realized they were witnessing something that would echo through generations of Western folklore, a true ghost story that transcended typical tales of the supernatural. In the years that followed, Sheriff Marcus Kane continued to serve Cedar Ridge until his natural death in 1889. 17 years after his miraculous return. The town prospered under his protection, becoming known throughout Utah territory as a place where justice prevailed and the supernatural was treated with respectful understanding rather than fear. Kane never spoke of what he experienced during those 3 days beyond death, taking those secrets to his second and final grave. The Ute elders who had witnessed his return passed down the story through oral tradition, recognizing it as a powerful example of how the spirit world sometimes intervenes in mortal affairs when justice demands it. Today, visitors to what remains of Cedar Ridge can still find Kane's grave in the old cemetery, marked by a simple headstone that bears 2 dates of death, the first crossed out, the second final. Local historians and paranormal researchers continue to investigate this remarkable case of documented resurrection, one of the most compelling true horror stories from America's western frontier. The tale serves as a reminder that in the dark expanse of the American West, where folklore and reality often intertwined, even death itself could not always claim the final word. Some say that on quiet nights, when injustice threatens to take hold, the spirit of Sheriff Kane still watches over the land, ensuring that the balance between good and evil remains intact in the haunting landscape of the old frontier.